Hi, Sarah Jacobs here. Today's topic, restraining orders and how they affect your divorce, is a weighty one. While restraining orders are necessary and protect families from harm, they also come with additional considerations for a lot of families when divorce is involved. Generally, there are two types of restraining orders that can impact a divorce: temporary restraining orders and final restraining orders. Both of these types of orders can restrict communications between parties or limit physical proximity, all of which can be challenging when the parties are trying to navigate a divorce and co-parent their children. For example, if a temporary restraining order is entered, because it provides immediate protection for the alleged victim, the order can require that there be either limited or no communication between the parties, or restrict the way that the communication can happen, such as in writing by text message only, force the alleged perpetrator to leave the residence, require that the alleged perpetrator pay support, either alimony, child support, or for expenses and bills for the alleged victim on a temporary basis, or be subject to suspended parenting time or supervised parenting time for a child that the parties may have in common. Provisions of a temporary restraining order vary and are entered by a case-by-case basis and last until the entry of a final restraining order. Generally, the final restraining order is supposed to be heard 10 days from when the original temporary restraining order was issued, but that can also vary depending on the parties and what's going on in the court. If there's a divorce involved, whether the divorce was started before the act of domestic violence or begun after the issue of the temporary restraining order, communications with restrictions in place can be challenging. This creates hurdles for parties as they try to co-parent their children, pay bills, and make decisions regarding their divorce. This can even be more challenging when all communications have to go through their respective attorneys or have to take place in writing. Restraining orders can also impact the parties if they wish to mediate. They need to make sure that they're doing so with a mediator who's trained in domestic violence, and there needs to be extra precautions in place. If there's an in-person mediation, there needs to be things such as separate conference rooms, staggered arrival and departure times, as well as caucus, where the mediator travels between the different conference rooms and has discussions with the parties separately instead of at the mediation table together. Another big question for divorcing parties in New Jersey when restraining orders are in place is what happens to their children. Based on existing case law, temporary restraining orders often award custody to the alleged victim. That can remain in place until either the final restraining order hearing or the alleged victim files a motion with the court to modify restrictions on parenting time or custody. The court can put certain precautions in place for the children, such as suspension of parenting time or supervision of parenting time, if they feel that the alleged perpetrator is a danger to the child or the child might be at risk from ongoing contact with that parent. If the court does enter precautions for a child at the issuance of a temporary restraining order, that doesn't mean that the parent accused of domestic violence is automatically stripped of parenting rights or custody permanently. The court needs to consider a lot of other factors and may order what's known as a psychological evaluation in order to help determine whether the alleged perpetrator is a risk to themselves, the child, or the other spouse on a more permanent basis. The court also needs to look at a variety of factors, such as whether the violence was perpetrated against the other parent or the child or both, whether there's been a history of domestic violence between the parents, whether the alleged perpetrator has a violent criminal history, whether there are current criminal charges pending, and a lot of other factors that help the court ascertain what is the best custody arrangement for the child, especially if the court is going to enter a final restraining order against the alleged perpetrator. Generally, the courts do believe that children benefit from regular ongoing contact with both parents. So even if the court is inclined to enter a final restraining order against the alleged perpetrator and protections for the alleged victim, the question of custody and parenting time still remains. As we discussed before with the temporary restraining order, the court can, on the entry of a final restraining order, enter certain precautions to make sure that the children are safe. They can opt to enter supervised parenting time restrictions. They can opt to continue suspension of parenting time until risk assessments or psychological evaluations are completed, or they can opt to allow for regular ongoing parenting time with no restrictions. It's important to remember that final restraining orders in New Jersey continue after the divorce is over. So even when things like selling a house or dividing a retirement asset come after your divorce judgment is signed, you need to remember that the restrictions and precautions in place with the final restraining order still govern how the way spouses communicate with each other. You need to follow the requirements and restrictions of a final restraining order, even when the judgment has already been entered. What happens if the ink on your divorce judgment is dry and you and your ex-spouse decide that the precautions of the final restraining order are no longer necessary and you need to communicate differently, especially when it comes to your children? The short answer, don't. Unless the victim voluntarily dismisses the restraining order, the precautions stay in place. You, as the perpetrator, if you communicate with the victim and the victim changes their mind, they can report you, and then you have a whole other issue with contempt of a restraining order. Therefore, you need to make sure that if you and your ex-spouse want to change the restrictions of the restraining order, you do so through the proper channels. As we said, restraining orders are necessary, but they can complicate divorce. We've helped families just like yours navigate the nuances of restraining orders and divorce. We've come up with creative ways to keep you safe while also making sure that communication takes place. If you have a restraining order and you're going through a divorce and you need a little bit of guidance, we're here to help. We look forward to talking with you.